You're standing in a candlelit chamber in the year 1289, watching what appears to be a wedding celebration. But something feels terribly wrong. The bride, barely 14 winters old, trembles as community elders inspect bloodied bed linens like merchants examining precious cloth. Her new husband, a man 3 times her age, stands nearby counting coins while village women chant prayers over mysterious herbal concoctions. This isn't romance. This isn't even what we might recognize as human intimacy. This is medieval sexuality, a world so alien to our modern understanding that it would make your skin crawl and your mind reel with disbelief. What you're about to discover will shatter every romantic notion you've ever held about the Middle Ages. Behind the fairy tale castles and chivalrous knights lay sexual practices so bizarre, so controlled by fear and superstition, that they transformed the most intimate moments of human life into public spectacles of shame and terror. The medieval bedroom wasn't private. It was a courtroom where bodies became evidence, where the church's doctrine battled ancient pagan rituals, and where the most personal acts were governed by rules so twisted they would horrify modern sensibilities. These weren't personal choices. They were matters of eternal salvation, family honor, and literally life or death. Let me transport you back to an era where the wrong sexual position could damn your soul to hell for eternity, where menstrual blood was considered so toxic it could wither crops, and where marriage wasn't about love, but about public verification of bodily functions. Medieval Europe treated marriage beds like battlefields where entire communities had stakes in what happened between husband and wife. When young couples wed in the 13th century, their unions weren't celebrated with champagne and dancing. They were business transactions sealed with bodily fluids and witnessed by neighbors who demanded proof that legal binding had occurred. The wedding night ritual began hours before any intimate contact took place. Picture this grotesque ceremony, called the bedding ritual, where wedding guests would literally drag the newly married couple to their chamber, strip them naked, while singing crude songs, then stand outside the door listening for sounds that would confirm the marriage was legally valid. These weren't distant relatives making polite conversation. These were community members who wouldn't leave until they heard the bride's cries of pain, proving her virginity had been taken and the marriage consummated. But here's where medieval intimacy becomes truly nightmarish. The church taught that even married couples could commit mortal sins in their own beds. Saint Jerome, writing in the 4th century, declared that a man who loved his wife too passionately was committing adultery. The church fathers believed that excessive pleasure, even within marriage, corrupted the soul and led to damnation. This wasn't merely theoretical theology. It shaped every aspect of medieval sexual practice. Thomas Aquinas, the great medieval theologian, laid out explicit rules for married couples in his writings around 1265. Sexual intercourse was only acceptable on specific days of the week, during certain seasons, and in one particular position: man on top, woman beneath, face to face. Any deviation was considered against nature and therefore sinful. Oral contact was forbidden entirely. Sex during menstruation, pregnancy, or while breastfeeding was prohibited. The church calculated that if all these rules were followed strictly, married couples would only be able to have intimate relations about 50 days per year. 50 days out of 365. Young brides learned these rules from their mothers, who learned them from village priests during confession. The weight of eternal damnation hung over every intimate moment. When a husband reached for his wife on a Forbidden Wednesday during Lent, she faced an impossible choice: submit to her husband's demands and risk her immortal soul, or refuse and face his wrath in a world where domestic violence wasn't just legal but expected. The medieval understanding of female bodies was built on fundamental misunderstandings that would persist for centuries. Medical texts from the period, influenced by ancient Greek and Roman sources, taught that women were essentially defective men. Their intimate organs were simply inverted versions of male anatomy. The female reproductive system was considered an inside-out version of male parts. This wasn't mere ignorance. It was codified medical knowledge taught in universities across Europe. These beliefs had profound consequences for how medieval people understood female desire and pleasure. Physicians like Constantine the African, writing in the 11th century, claimed that women experienced physical pleasure differently than men. They required prolonged stimulation and multiple releases to conceive. This led to the bizarre medical belief that forced relations couldn't result in pregnancy because the woman couldn't achieve the necessary pleasure. If a woman became pregnant after assault, medieval courts often took it as evidence that she had enjoyed the experience and was therefore partially responsible for what happened to her. The victim became the accused, trapped by medical theories that made her body the evidence of her supposed consent. Medieval mothers warned their daughters about the wandering womb, a condition physicians believed could cause hysteria, madness, and even death. They thought the uterus could literally move around inside a woman's body, traveling upward to strangle her heart or downward to escape through her intimate areas. Treatments included fumigating the female anatomy with pleasant smells to lure the womb back into place, or applying foul-smelling substances to the nose to drive it downward. These weren't folk remedies practiced by ignorant peasants. These were official medical treatments prescribed by university-trained physicians and recorded in scholarly texts that were copied and distributed throughout medieval Europe. The medieval period inherited a complex web of fertility beliefs from pagan traditions that the church never quite managed to eradicate completely. Village-wise women, often branded as witches by later generations, maintained underground knowledge of herbs, rituals, and practices designed to encourage conception, prevent pregnancy, or ensure the birth of male children. In forests surrounding medieval villages, women would gather specific plants under the full moon. Pennyroyal and tansy were brewed into teas that could prevent pregnancy, though the dosage between contraception and death was perilously thin. Mandrake root, shaped like a human figure, was believed to increase fertility when worn as an amulet against the skin. The root was so valuable that forged versions made from carved bryony were common in medieval markets. The church officially condemned these practices as witchcraft, but even devout Christians couldn't entirely abandon them. The line between folk medicine and magic was impossibly blurred. A woman might pray to Saint Margaret for safe childbirth, while simultaneously burying a piece of afterbirth under her threshold to ensure future fertility. She might wear a crucifix to church while hiding a piece of amber between her breasts to prevent miscarriage. Medieval contraception was a dangerous blend of superstition, poison, and desperation. Women were taught to jump backwards 7 times after intimate relations to prevent conception, or to drink wine mixed with ground-up bees. More dangerous were potions made from mercury, lead, and other toxic substances that often killed the woman along with any potential pregnancy. The consequences of unwanted pregnancy were severe beyond modern comprehension. In a world without reliable contraception, women faced the constant threat of death in childbirth. Maternal mortality rates were staggering. 1 in 3 women died during or shortly after delivery. For unmarried women, pregnancy often meant social destruction, exile, or execution. The practice of infanticide, while officially condemned, was widely understood as a desperate woman's final resort. This world of medieval sexuality was governed not by love or mutual desire, but by terror, superstition, and the constant surveillance of bodies that were never truly private. Medieval marriage negotiations were conducted like military campaigns, with bodies serving as the primary battlefield and currency of exchange. When fathers arranged marriages for their daughters, virginity became literally more valuable than gold or livestock. The hymen transformed into a currency of family honor, traded between households as proof of their daughter's purity and their own social reputation. The wedding night wasn't simply about consummation. It was about public verification of the bride's untouched state. The bloodied sheets would be displayed to assembled crowds as proof that the marriage was legitimate and binding. If no blood appeared, the bride could be returned to her family in disgrace, branded with terms that would destroy her forever, or even killed for what was considered fraud against her new husband's family. The pressure on young brides was enormous beyond modern comprehension. Some would secretly prick their fingers or hide chicken blood to fabricate the evidence their new families demanded. But medieval medicine's understanding of female anatomy was so fundamentally flawed that these desperate measures often proved unnecessary or insufficient. Medieval physicians believed the hymen was a solid membrane that completely blocked intimate access rather than the partial, flexible tissue it actually is. They thought its absence was absolute proof of previous relations, when in fact it could be torn by horseback riding, heavy lifting, or simply natural variation in anatomy that had nothing to do with intimate contact. The Church's doctrine of consummation created its own bizarre legal practices that turned intimate acts into matters of public record. A marriage wasn't considered legally binding until physical union had occurred, which meant that proving or disproving consummation became a matter of official legal inquiry that could determine inheritance, political alliances, and family fortunes. Church courts would examine both husband and wife, interviewing them separately about intimate details of their wedding night, with the same clinical detachment used for property disputes. They would inspect the woman as body for signs of penetration and question neighbors about what sounds they had heard through chamber walls. Privacy didn't exist when bodies became legal evidence. Medieval intimate positions were strictly regulated by church doctrine, but the reality was far more complex and dangerous than official teachings suggested. Medieval intimate positions were strictly regulated by church doctrine, but the reality was far more complex and dangerous than official teachings suggested. The church taught that any position placing the woman above the man violated the natural order of male dominance established by divine will. Rear entry was considered bestial, linking human intimacy to animal mating practices that degraded the sacred nature of marriage. These weren't suggestions or preferences. They were religious laws backed by threats of excommunication and hellfire. Yet medieval literature hints at a shadow world where reality diverged dramatically from official doctrine. The fabliaux bawdy comic tales popular in medieval France describe encounters that would have scandalized church authorities. These stories, told by traveling minstrels in taverns and market squares, reveal underground practices where couples experimented with forbidden techniques despite threats of eternal punishment. The French poet Andreas Capellanus, writing around 1184, described elaborate courtship rituals that included detailed instructions for positions and techniques that went far beyond church-approved methods. His work suggests that among the nobility, there existed sophisticated understanding of physical pleasure that contradicted official religious teachings entirely. However, these practices were dangerous secrets that could cost lives. Discovery could mean excommunication, exile, or execution. Medieval people lived in constant terror of being caught violating intimate laws that governed their most private moments. Medieval communities believed they lived under constant threat from supernatural entities that preyed on humans during their most vulnerable intimate moments. Medieval communities believed they lived under constant threat from supernatural entities that preyed on humans during their most vulnerable intimate moments. They were accepted medical and theological facts that shaped how people understood desire and physical relations. Church authorities taught that these demons could assume human form to seduce men and women, stealing their life essence through intimate contact. The succubus, a female demon who targeted men, was blamed for nocturnal emissions, intimate dreams, and any sensual thoughts that occurred outside marriage bonds. Medieval theologians developed elaborate theories about how these supernatural predators operated. They believed a demon could first take female form to collect seed from a man, then transform into male form to impregnate a woman with the stolen essence. Any child born from such unholy union was believed to be cursed or demonic, marked for a life of suffering and evil. The incubus posed an even greater threat to medieval women. These male demons were said to possess superhuman strength, capable of overpowering their victims during sleep. Women who reported strange dreams or experiences they couldn't explain were often accused of consorting with demons willingly. The line between victim and witch became terrifyingly thin. Sleep paralysis, now understood as a neurological phenomenon, was interpreted as demonic assault. Men and women who woke unable to move, often experiencing pressure on their chest, were believed to be under supernatural attack. The church prescribed elaborate rituals of exorcism and purification, but many suspected victims were burned as witches instead of receiving help. The medieval understanding of menstruation was rooted in terror and superstition that would persist for centuries beyond the Middle Ages. Menstrual blood was believed to be poison, so toxic it could kill crops, sour wine, and drain men of their vital essence. Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder, whose works remained standard texts in medieval universities, claimed menstrual blood could drive dogs insane and cause metal blades to lose their sharpness. Women during their monthly cycles were considered dangerous pollutants who must be isolated from normal society to protect others from contamination. They couldn't enter churches, prepare food, or touch sacred objects. In many villages, menstruating women were required to live in special huts outside the community until their bleeding ceased completely. The church taught that menstruation was divine punishment for Eve's original sin, making every monthly cycle a reminder of feminine shame and spiritual corruption. This wasn't metaphorical theology, but literal medical doctrine that shaped how half the population was treated during regular biological functions. Medieval physicians prescribed bizarre treatments based on these poisonous beliefs. They thought menstrual blood that was improperly expelled would accumulate inside the body and poison the woman from within. Treatments included bloodletting, purging, and other dangerous procedures designed to balance what they called female humors. Some doctors recommended intimate contact as a cure for menstrual disorders, believing male essence could neutralize the toxic effects of female blood. These were unfringed theories, but mainstream medical practices, taught in universities and prescribed by the most educated physicians of the era. The medieval period witnessed the rise of elaborate theories about intimate compatibility based on astrological signs, bodily humors, and physical characteristics that determined whether couples could successfully produce children. Medieval physicians believed that physical pleasure and fertility depended on proper balance of hot and cold, wet and dry humors in both partners. A hot-tempered husband might be considered incompatible with a cold-natured wife, leading to dysfunction and childlessness that could annul marriages and destroy family alliances. Physical examination of potential spouses became common among wealthy families seeking to ensure successful unions. These examinations were conducted with the same clinical detachment used for evaluating livestock. Physicians would inspect brides for signs of their intimate temperament, measuring hip width as indicators of fertility potential. Grooms underwent similar scrutiny, with size and shape analyzed for compatibility with intended brides. The church developed its own theories about intimate compatibility based on spiritual rather than physical characteristics. They taught that couples too closely related by blood or spiritual kinship would be cursed with dysfunction and monstrous offspring. Complex rules of relationship meant many medieval marriages were later annulled when previously unknown family connections were discovered, sometimes years after children were born. Medieval sexuality became deeply entangled with concepts of honor, shame, and social standing that determined a person's entire place in their community. A man's intimate prowess was directly linked to his reputation as a warrior and leader. Physical dysfunction wasn't merely a private embarrassment. It was a public humiliation that could destroy a man as standing in society and render him powerless in political and economic matters. The medieval French developed elaborate euphemisms for intimate dysfunction, creating an entire vocabulary of shame that permeated every aspect of social interaction. These weren't crude jokes or casual insults. They were precise social weapons that could devastate reputations and destroy lives with a few carefully chosen words. For women, intimate reputation was even more fragile and dangerous. The slightest hint of impropriety could obliterate a woman's marriage prospects and her family's honor for generations. Medieval towns were small communities where everyone monitored everyone else's behavior with the intensity of professional investigators. A woman seen speaking to a man who wasn't her husband or blood relative could be branded with terms that would follow her to the grave. The standards of female behavior were so restrictive that even married women lived in constant fear of gossip and accusation that could transform them from respected wives into social outcasts overnight. The medieval legal system reflected these intimate anxieties in its treatment of assault, adultery, and violations that revealed how little women's bodies belonged to themselves. Forced relations weren't defined as crimes against women, but as crimes against the men who owned them, fathers, husbands, or feudal lords who held property rights over female bodies. Punishment for such violations varied dramatically depending on the social status of both victim and perpetrator. A nobleman who violated a peasant woman might pay a small fine equivalent to damaging livestock. A peasant who violated a noblewoman would face torture and execution that could last for days. Adultery was punished even more severely, but only for women. A married woman who engaged in intimate contact with any man other than her husband could be legally murdered by her husband with no consequences whatsoever. Medieval law codes specifically granted husbands the right to kill adulterous wives and their lovers if caught in the act. Men, however, remained generally free to engage in relations with unmarried women, prostitutes, or their own servants without legal repercussions. This wasn't informal tolerance, but official legal doctrine that enshrined male intimate privilege while criminalizing female desire. The medieval period saw the development of elaborate courtship rituals that would influence European culture for centuries while creating bizarre splits between official doctrine and actual practice. The tradition of courtly love, popularized in troubadour poetry, created a parallel world where intimate desire was elevated to a spiritual quest that could never be fulfilled. These romantic ideals were primarily literary fantasies enjoyed by the nobility, but they had profound effects on how medieval people understood the relationship between love and physical intimacy. The courtly love tradition taught that true love could only exist outside of marriage, creating an impossible contradiction at the heart of medieval relationships. A knight's devotion to his lady was supposed to remain eternally unfulfilled, existing in a state of constant yearning that purified the soul through suffering. This created a devastating split between marital intimacy, which was purely functional for reproduction, and romantic love, which was purely spiritual and could never be physically consummated. The reality of medieval courtship among common people was far more pragmatic and brutal. Young peasants might have some limited choice in marriage partners, but economic considerations always took absolute precedence over personal preference or attraction. A village girl might favor the blacksmith's son for his kindness or strength, but if the miller offered better terms to her father, she would find herself married to a man she barely knew and might actively despise. Love was a luxury that survival rarely permitted. Medieval engagement practices included rituals designed to test the compatibility of potential spouses without violating church doctrine about premarital contact. In some regions, engaged couples were allowed to sleep together while fully clothed, separated by a wooden board called a bundling board. This practice allowed families to evaluate whether couples were physically compatible without risking pregnancy or violating religious laws about intimate contact before marriage. The bundling board became a symbol of the impossible contradictions that governed medieval relationships, intimate enough to assess compatibility, distant enough to maintain purity. The medieval period inherited a complex tradition of intimate magic and fertility rituals from earlier pagan cultures that Christian persecution drove underground but never entirely eliminated. Medieval peasants continued practicing ancient fertility rituals, often disguised as Christian celebrations or incorporated into folk medicine that existed parallel to official church doctrine. The celebration of May Day retained powerful connections to fertility and reproduction, despite church attempts to suppress its pagan origins. Young people would spend entire nights in forests, ostensibly gathering flowers and branches to decorate villages. In reality, May Day provided opportunities for intimate experimentation and courtship outside normal village restrictions. Many pregnancies were calculated to result from May Day encounters, leading to predictable surges in February births that everyone understood but no one officially acknowledged. These weren't accidents, but deliberate seasonal patterns that connected human reproduction to agricultural cycles that predated Christianity by thousands of years. Wedding celebrations included numerous fertility rituals designed to ensure couples' reproductive success through combinations of Christian prayer and pagan magic. Brides might be showered with grain or nuts to encourage pregnancy through sympathetic magic that linked agricultural abundance to human fertility. Marriage beds would be blessed with holy water by priests, but also secretly prepared with herbs and charms believed to enhance fertility and protect against evil influences. These practices represented desperate attempts to control reproduction in a world where infant mortality was devastating and family survival depended entirely on producing healthy children who could work and inherit. The medieval understanding of conception was a bizarre blend of Aristotelian philosophy, Christian doctrine, and folk wisdom that created theories so strange they defy modern comprehension. Medieval physicians believed that both men and women produced seed that combined during intimate contact to create new life, through processes they described in elaborate technical detail. They taught that female physical pleasure was absolutely necessary for conception, leading to tragic beliefs that women who became pregnant after assault must have enjoyed the experience. This wasn't casual victim blaming, but official medical doctrine that transformed rape survivors into suspected accomplices in their own violations. Medieval people developed intricate theories about influencing the gender of unborn children through timing, positioning, and environmental factors. They believed that conception during certain lunar phases would produce male children, while others would result in females. The position of stars at the moment of conception was thought to influence not only the child's gender, but also personality and future prospects. These were superstitions practiced by ignorant peasants, but sophisticated astrological calculations performed by educated physicians and nobles who invested enormous resources in timing conception to produce desired heirs. Royal families would consult court astronomers to determine optimal moments for intimate contact that might produce male heirs to continue dynasties. The medieval period witnessed the development of increasingly sophisticated methods of intimate control and surveillance that transformed private behavior into matters of public concern. The church established extensive networks of informants who reported on their neighbors' private lives with the dedication of professional spies. Confession became a tool for gathering intimate details about private practices, with priests questioning penitents about their most personal moments, using detailed manuals that specified exactly what information to extract. These weren't casual conversations, but systematic interrogations designed to monitor and control intimate behavior throughout Christian communities. The rise of the Inquisition in the 13th century brought new levels of persecution that extended far beyond religious beliefs to encompass intimate practices. Suspected heretics were tortured into confessing not only their theological opinions, but also their private behaviors, in chambers designed specifically for extracting information about the most personal aspects of human life. Interrogation manuals used by inquisitors included detailed questions about intimate positions, frequency of contact, and even physical sensations experienced during private moments. These documents reveal the Church as obsessive interest in controlling every aspect of human intimacy, while officially preaching celibacy and spiritual purity. Medieval prisons included specialized punishments for intimate crimes that were designed not just to punish the guilty, but to terrorize entire communities into compliance with church doctrine. Women convicted of adultery might be imprisoned in cages so small they couldn't stand upright, fed only bread and water until they died of starvation or disease. Men convicted of assault might be publicly castrated before being hanged, with their mutilated bodies displayed as warnings to others who might consider violating the intricate web of laws that governed intimate behavior. These extreme punishments were calculated to create terror that would prevent others from challenging the system that controlled their most private moments. The medieval period produced vast literature offering intimate advice and instruction, though most remained hidden from ordinary people who couldn't read and had no access to expensive manuscripts. Medical texts included detailed descriptions of positions and techniques, but these were available only to educated physicians and wealthy patrons who could afford private libraries. The average medieval person learned about intimacy through whispered conversations, folk songs, and bitter experience of trial and error that often resulted in injury, disease, or unwanted pregnancy. Official education about intimate matters was virtually non-existent, leading most people to navigate these dangerous waters without guidance or support. The Church produced its own intimate literature, but it focused primarily on cataloging sins rather than providing positive guidance for married couples. Penitential manuals listed hundreds of intimate practices with corresponding punishments, creating encyclopedias of forbidden behavior that revealed far more about clerical obsessions than helpful advice for actual relationships. These texts demonstrate the Church as fascinating contradiction, official celibacy combined with detailed knowledge of intimate practices that supposedly celibate priests should not have possessed. The gap between official doctrine and actual knowledge suggests that medieval religious authorities were far more familiar with intimate matters than their vows of chastity would suggest. This world of medieval intimacy was never truly private, never truly safe, and never truly free from the surveillance of communities that treated bodies as public property subject to collective judgment and control.